Hello, it is 1DM here to talk a bit about game design philosophy. Out of all the tabletop role-playing games on the market today, Pathfinder 2nd Edition might be the most intentional about game balance. Certainly, its designers put a lot of thought into their design philosophy. In this video, I'm going to discuss what this philosophy is, both as stated by them and in my perception. I'm going to talk about what this philosophy accomplishes and what other designs accomplish differently. Finally, I'll talk about what this philosophy lacks in my eyes and what might still be better about the game. Before I do any of that, a quick disclaimer. I am biased. I love Pathfinder 2e. I'm not going to try to hide that. Everything here is my opinion. When I discuss other games, though, I'm not going to try to argue that Pathfinder is superior, only that it has certain upsides and downsides. Now, let's get to it. So first and foremost, what is Pathfinder 2e's design philosophy? I personally think that underlying everything in the system is Rule 0, the game should be balanced. This is a complicated thing. What exactly is balance? It feels very intuitive, right? There shouldn't be some single character build that feels absurdly powerful. Many different builds across ancestries and classes should all feel similar in their power level. But what is power level? How do you measure it? It's not just about damage output, though that is important. And more than that, if you strike upon this magical idea of balance, how do you maintain that in a game system that continues to expand for years on end? The answer is complicated. I'm not going to make an attempt at rigorously defining it. That would be a whole other video. But you get the general idea. The designers want the system to allow for many balanced options. So keep that idea in mind as I look at some more specific points of the overall design philosophy. Let's start with a few items that stick out to me personally from reading the core rulebook. These aren't listed in any particular order. Item number 1. A player should have many options to pick from, both in creating their character and then playing that character. Included in this point, referring back to Rule 0, is that these options should be reasonably balanced with one another, such that there are many good ways to build a character and many good things to do with your turn. I think anyone who's ever opened the core rulebook will find this point pretty obvious. The sheer number of feats available to each class makes it pretty clear that characters have many options, and pretty few of them feel like objectively bad options. Item number 2. The system should provide clear rulings on as many common actions as possible. The concept of a tabletop role-playing game inherently comes with limitless choice in play, as a player character can always come up with creative ideas. Pathfinder 2e doesn't make any attempt to account for every possible action, as that's obviously impossible, but it accounts for a large number of actions that players often try. Rules for hiding, intimidating, and feinting are clearly defined and have mechanical benefits as well as downsides. The system will rarely call for a GM to just make up a ruling on the spot. Item number 3. The rulings provided should make an attempt at realism. This point might be debated a little bit, but I think there are a lot of examples in this system where it visibly makes more attempt at realism than its previous iteration. For example, Pathfinder 2e's rules allow you to hold your breath for roughly 12 to 30 seconds while in a fight, after which you're unconscious and dying. In Pathfinder 1st Edition, this value was more likely to be 90 seconds, after which you could still make saves to stay conscious, all while in a fight to the death? I know one example doesn't prove the point, but I don't really want to spend 5 minutes on this. Suffice it to say, I generally think the system's rulings put more emphasis on realism, at least in non-magical scenarios. If you disagree, let me know in the comments. These are the 3 biggest things that have stuck out to me from Pathfinder 2nd Edition's core rulebook. They're just what come to mind when I sat down to think about it. But those are what I think their philosophy is. What do they actually say about it? There was a panel at GenCon 2019, which was on the same weekend the core rulebook was published, in which 3 of the 4 lead designers discussed their approach to the game's philosophy. It wasn't a highly organized keynote presentation, and the items they discussed weren't intended to be core principles or a rigorous philosophy, but the points do give us more insights into their approach. Especially, the points made emphasize on the difference in their approach to Pathfinder 1st and 2nd Edition. They also made 3 overall points, which again are in no particular order. Item 1. There shouldn't be multiple systems trying to do the same thing. The example Jason Bowman gave was that in 1st Edition, multi-classes, prestige classes, and archetypes were all systems trying to do the same thing. So in 2nd Edition, they reduced them to one system called archetypes. The idea is to not lose any of the robust design that was already there, while removing unnecessary bloat from the system. Item 2. Your choices and actions should matter. This obviously applies to character creation options like feats. Your choices and customization should have a visible impact on gameplay. But more than that, Logan Bonner was talking about this in regards to the idea of cost. If attempting to recall knowledge about an enemy creature is a free action, then every PC will do it for every enemy, every encounter, because it can be very useful sometimes. This slows down play immensely for actions that often won't have much impact. So in designing the new system, they tried wherever possible to make sure your actions have a cost to them, usually one of your actions, so that the action feels meaningful to do rather than a given. Similarly, the reward should be such that it also feels impactful. Item 3. The system should be modular. I find it funny that this point was brought up by Mark Seifter, who has been a professional coder, as the logic system of the game also reminds me of object-oriented coding. His point, though, was that the system should be easily modifiable and expandable. You've probably noticed this in the way Pathfinder 2nd Edition's books present rules elements. For many different subsystems, elements are presented as individual blocks of text, clearly formatted to indicate how someone could create another option like it. Everything from feats and spells to planes, diseases, and libraries can be created using this format. This makes the system easy to expand on, not only for Paizo as they publish more content, but also for players who want to homebrew another rule. It's extremely easy for a player to homebrew a new feat or spell to help create a unique character concept. There's one more design principle they make note of, which isn't so much a guiding philosophy as a useful trick. They call it the Rumpelstiltskin principle, and it states that naming something gives you power over it. They specifically refer to the proficiency system, where in 1st edition each skill had numerical ranks and you had to specify a number of ranks in order to figure out your exact modifier. In 2nd edition, the proficiency system has 4 ranks, each with specific names: trained, expert, master, and legendary. Not only does this make proficiency a unified system across saves, attacks, and skills, it also allows the system to be quickly referred to with simple titles that reflect a character's power level. When I tell you my character is legendary in athletics, it lets me calculate their modifier and tell you that I'm really heckin' good at athletics at the same time. So this is the general overview of Pathfinder 2e's design philosophy. The game should be balanced, include many choices, and have clear rulings that attempt realism. Its system should be streamlined. Character actions should have weight, and finally, the system should be modular. You may disagree or want to add some points. I realize this isn't perfect, and it's largely based on my perception of the game. But if we assume that this is an accurate reflection of the game, and assume it does a pretty good job of accomplishing all these, how does it affect the gameplay? These principles each affect the actual gameplay of Pathfinder 2e in different ways, each with their own pros and cons. I'm going to reduce them to 3 broad effects on the game. Together, they contribute to system longevity, strategic gameplay, and ease of learning. Let's start with system longevity. Since players have so many choices to pick from, and their choices have weight, this results in a game where building your character and thinking about how they'll play is a significant portion of the game and can be a great deal of fun. Since there are so many ways to build any given character class, no player will ever be able to experience all of the mechanical options in the game. A player could play a dozen adventure paths without running out of new ways to play, and can thus stay invested in the system for a long time. Also contributing to longevity are the principles that the game should be modular and include clear rulings. Clear rulings mean that a player's experience won't be too different from GM to GM, which allows players to invest in learning the system rather than learning their GM. Modularity, of course, allows Paizo to continue creating new content for the system for a long time. This adds more longevity on the player's end by continuing to ensure they don't run out of ways to play, and at the same time adds longevity on Paizo's end by ensuring that they can continue to profit off of their product. Altogether, these points make for a system that could potentially have new content, new adventures, and continuing players for many years. If Pathfinder 1e was any indication, then at least a decade, if not more. The second effect that these elements have together is strategic gameplay. Having a character with many options, actions that have weight, and clear rulings creates a game space with deep strategic choices in it. Pathfinder 2e combat can't be meaningfully reduced to a few numbers or solved in any way. There are many valid strategies and approaches. Strategic gameplay makes the game interesting to play and again contributes to its longevity. The third effect is ease of learning. You might be surprised to hear me say that, as Pathfinder 2e is not a particularly easy game to learn. And yes, this is a point that has a bit of tension in it. Having clear rulings does mean that the rules must be more rigorous and thus more to learn. But at the same time, the streamlining of redundant systems reduces the amount of rules to keep track of. And the principle of balance should allow new players to make good characters without knowing everything about the system. There aren't really any must-have character options that they're screwing themselves by not using. As a whole, the system will definitely be more to learn than a rules-light system, or a system that places the burden of rulings on the GM, but it's still less to learn than other crunchy systems. So I've pretty thoroughly discussed what I perceive to be the design philosophy of Pathfinder 2e, as well as its benefits. But what do other systems have that Pathfinder doesn't? I'm going to compare Pathfinder 2e to 4 different kinds of systems with a specific example from each one. To start, let's compare it to rules light systems. The specific example I'm thinking of in this case is Dungeon World, but there are many, many rules light role-playing game systems out there. Obviously, a rules light system, by definition, focuses on being as easy to learn as possible. There are very few rules to know and keep track of, and these systems are often ones that players can learn while playing instead of spending any prep time on. This comes with a trade-off of strategic gameplay. Having few rules means that at its worst, combat can be reduced to a few equations and solved for the best option. At best, combat can be cinematic, relying on narration and creative ideas to gain advantages. This is a very different style of gameplay, and one that many enjoy, but it's not particularly strategic. These systems also trade off their longevity from the perspective of a designer, expanding the game with more content. Instead, they rely on longevity from more and different stories being told within their system. The area where rules light systems clearly beat Pathfinder, other than ease of learning, is their ability to encourage roleplay. Pathfinder never discourages roleplay or storytelling or cinematic combat narration, but because of its strategic rules, players can just say what actions they're performing and their mechanical effects instead of describing their character's actions. Personally, I want to roleplay more, but sometimes struggle going outside of my comfort zone, so it's easy to rely on the rules as a crutch to avoid roleplaying. So that is one clear benefit of rules light systems. The second category I want to compare Pathfinder to is what I like to call rules medium systems. Specifically, I'm thinking of, you guessed it, Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. This is a game that has a decent amount of rules to learn, but it doesn't make much of an attempt at rigorous and clear rulings on many actions. This results in a system that's easier to learn as a player, but it leaves a large burden on the GM to make their own rulings and fill in the gaps. D&D also makes even more effort to streamline systems, such as using advantage and disadvantage instead of floating modifiers, which further helps ease of learning but reduces the depth of strategic combat. The system also allows for more longevity than rules light systems, but has less wide customization than Pathfinder, so has a bit less room for expansion. It's also resulted in a game that isn't as thoroughly balanced. The power differential between the characters of a new player and an experienced player can be quite vast. I realize I'm being pretty critical of D&D here, and I know I'm biased as a Pathfinder fanboy. I do want to be clear that you can enjoy whatever you like, and if you don't need the strategic depth or insane customization that Pathfinder offers, then D&D may be the perfect game for you. My criticisms do not necessarily reflect how fun the game is to play. Next, though, let's look at how Pathfinder 2e compares to other rules-heavy systems. I'm specifically thinking of Pathfinder 1st Edition and Dungeons & Dragons 3.5e. I haven't actually played 3.5e, but as I understand it, these two systems are very similar to the point of being nearly interchangeable. As I said earlier, the principles outlined by Pathfinder 2e's lead designers were focused on the differences between it and 1e, so we have a very good idea of the design difference between the two. The big guiding principle that stands out is that 2e focused on ease of learning and ease of expansion, where 1e just didn't. In a chat with Luis Loza, he mentioned that the first edition rulebook was largely just a 3.5e reference document with some edits. It wasn't laid out for learning, it was laid out identically to the source. As I've said, 2e is still a pretty rules-heavy system and isn't super easy to learn, but it's miles better than its previous iteration. Other than that, 2e has similar longevity and strategic gameplay to 1e, both having many options for customization and choices. But 1e didn't focus as much on balance either. It was of note to the designers, but it wasn't as intentional from the very beginning, and as a result, Pathfinder 1st Edition is known for enabling character builds that break the game wide open. Experienced players at high levels could make characters that were absurdly powerful. 2e was designed from the ground up to curb this and significantly reduce the potential for power creep. In other words, Pathfinder 2e was designed to be better than 1e. I'm not at all going to argue that it is. Philosophically, from a game design perspective, its principles are better, but being a more fun game is a little more complicated than having a better philosophy. I personally enjoy 2e more, but again, you can enjoy what you want. Now we've looked at how Pathfinder 2e compares to some rules light, medium, and heavy systems. Each has pros and cons. Lastly, I want to compare it to something that people don't talk about as much: video games. Comparing a tabletop role-playing game to a video game is in one regard comparing apples to oranges. They are different things accomplishing different things. But I think we can learn something here, so bear with me. Specifically, I want to compare the design philosophy of Pathfinder 2e with the design philosophy of Path of Exile. Is it because both of them have path in their names, I hear you ask? No, it's just because I know both of them well. Path of Exile is a game that communicates its design ideas regularly, and while obviously video games will vary widely, it has some principles present in a lot of large games. I'll start with the things they have in common. Path of Exile tries to set up an environment with deep strategic gameplay in the form of many interactions between different elements. The support gem system and passive skill tree alone represent a multitude of choices for a character to make. This is a very similar principle to Pathfinder. Furthermore, Path of Exile cares a lot about the weight of player actions. The developers have chosen not to include auto-looting because clicking on items and filling space in your inventory makes items feel more impactful. They've also declined to add an auction house, as they believe making the trading system easier makes upgrading items more trivial and thus less impactful to the player. This takes a different form than actions having a cost in Pathfinder, but it's the same idea at the root. Your actions should have weight. And Path of Exile has also emphasized modularity. They release a new league every 3 months, with a new major expansion every 6 months. The skill gems and mapping systems allow for meaningful new content to be added regularly, although many would argue that this expansion has created a bit too much power creep and bloat. The Path of Exile philosophy of balance is pretty different, however. Chris Wilson, a creator and lead designer, has said, "It's okay for there to be some right answers. Powerful skills that are better than other ones because the discovery of these is a mastery behavior that makes players feel good about their progress." End quote. This is a very different idea than Pathfinder. Pathfinder tries to reduce power differentials between various characters by making many options at similar power levels. Path of Exile does still try to balance so as to promote build diversity, but it's okay with some options being better than others. Part of this comes down to Path of Exile being primarily a single-player game. Since you're not cooperating with a party, it won't feel so bad to be using a skill that's worse than your party member's skill. This method of balance is more common in video games, though many games also try to make many options as equally powerful as possible. Intentionally creating stronger and weaker options introduces an element of competitiveness into a game. The more a player discovers the strong options, the better they will perform in the game. Some games want this behavior. Pathfinder does not. Another difference is between tabletop role-playing games and video games as a whole. Rules-light and rules-heavy systems vary in their attempt to rigorously define rulings on a range of actions. Video games, by their very nature, rigorously define what actions are possible at all, and rigorously define the outcomes of possible actions, bugs notwithstanding. This, of course, is one of the major strengths of tabletop games. They allow players to act outside of the scope of defined rulings. A computer can't do that. Alright, so at this point I've discussed what Pathfinder 2e's design philosophy is, how it affects gameplay, and how it compares to other kinds of games. Now I want to finally ask the question, does Pathfinder 2e actually accomplish what it sets out to do in its design principles? And whether it does or not, what could be better about it? As a whole, I believe Pathfinder 2e does a really good job of accomplishing its goals. Character creation is deep and interesting and fun. The options available feel pretty well balanced. In 99% of situations, its rulings are clear. Its systems are vastly streamlined compared to other rules-heavy systems. Combat is complex and strategic. The system is easily added to. It just has a lot going for it. Of course, there are still things I think aren't perfect. I just have 2 points that I think could be better. These are criticisms I make because I love the system, and I don't really think they're huge detractors, but they're what could improve. First, I dislike that certain character options are only good at certain levels. This is a pretty specific nitpick. I'm referring to things like the Armor Proficiency General feat, which makes you trained in one type of armor heavier than your current training. This is nice at low levels, except that when a character reaches level 13, or earlier for some classes, they'll advance to Expert and the armor types granted by their class, but not armor types from this feat. So my Investigator can take this at level 3 to gain medium armor, but then at level 13, they'll be Expert in light armor and trained in medium armor, and then Master in light armor at 19. So going back to light armor is likely better for them. It feels weird for a character to regress to lighter armor at high levels for mechanical reasons. The same thing goes for the weapon proficiency general feat. I realize these proficiencies are supposed to be hard to get, and Paizo wouldn't just want to add another general feat for expert in armor, so this example isn't easily solved. And there are a few more examples of this, but not a ton, so it's not a huge problem with the system. But it feels a little bit awkward. My other comment has to do with ease of learning. I think the core rulebook could have done a slightly better job of teaching new players how to build a good character. It's a system where it's hard to build a bad character, but there are just a few details it would help to know. For example, I really think the core rulebook should encourage players to make sure they have an 18 in their key ability score for their class. For 90% of characters, this is the way to go to make sure they're actually good at what they want to do. Similarly, spells with the incapacitation trait have to be prepared in your highest level spell slot or they'll be basically useless. But the core rulebook relegates the trait to a sidebar with a list of other common traits and spells. I simply think this could have had more attention called to it to prevent the mistake of newer players preparing them in low-level slots. Again, this problem isn't that huge and can be helped by just being communicative with new players in Session 0, if the GM is experienced enough to know. It's just one thing that could make learning the game easier. But other than that, I don't have a lot more I want from this game. I think it's a very robust system that could very well interest me for many years to come. Alright, I've been talking for a while. I want to hear what you think. What design principles did I miss? What could Pathfinder 2e still do better? Go at it in the comments and I'll respond to as many as I can. If you like this video, also feel free to like and subscribe so I can know to do more like it. If you didn't, please let me know in the comments what I can do better or what you'd like to see instead. But this is 1DM out. Have a great day.